sent out an email with a copy of a Seder. And the reason it was very important this year to my family is my children became incensed because they referred to this as kind of a cute custom, and they talked about appetizers before dinner. And so two of my daughters wrote on Facebook and wrote to the RA and complained, and because they felt that the Sephardic ritual was being minimized. And the truth is that when I married into my family, Eliashiv and his brother were here, and his brother was the, blessed memory, was the leader of the Sephardic congregation in Brookline. This is what I got into, and this is the only thing my children knew. Barry, you've been a participant some years, and this is a copy of sort of something that we got, and this is my family's that has wine stains and other stains, and this is the booklet that my daughter made. But now, first of all, we observe Erev. So we observe Erev, Rosh Hashanah, and the second night. And in our family, the afternoon meals were not quite so festive, unless we got invited somewhere. Thank you, Falkoffs. And in the evenings, I'm sure most of you have probably apples and honey on the table, but we have a lazy Susan where we have dates, pomegranates, apples, honey, squash. We usually use zucchini, string beans, or it's supposed to be black-eyed peas. I don't even know what they are. Leek, beets, and the highlight of the meal for my children was the head of a fish. And every year we had a fight because Ellie liked to go out and get a fish and put the head on the table. And of course my kids were appalled. So we had the head of the fish undercover, and now we can find Swedish fish that are kosher. Okay, so that seems to be the solution, though some people have used the head of a lettuce. And the tradition is that there are certain words which sound like other words, and they're basically puns, and they're not really blessings. They're really curses, actually, in some cases. Because, for example, I'll give you the beets. And beet in Hebrew, Lila, do you do this? Oh, you're muted. Okay. Beets in Hebrew is selek, and selek is supposed to sound like Yistalku. I don't know. My Hebrew is not great. It sounds like Yistalku. So we call them Yehi Ratzon. All of these are Yehi Ratzonis. So it's Yehi Ratzon milfanecha Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu sheyistalku oivenu v'sonenu v'chol v'achshenu ra'atenu, which means basically, may it be the will of God that you chase away our enemies and haters. So this is, or that you beat our enemies. So there's a lot of puns, and we go through this for each of those things. And then we have chicken soup and knedlach and whatever else I make. So this is our Rosh Hashanah tradition. We do it both nights. In Israel, they actually do it 2 nights. This year, they had a shutdown. So Ellie's family, instead of doing it on Friday, did it, one sister did it on Wednesday and one on Thursday, so the family could join. Otherwise, everybody was in their own homes and they weren't allowed to go anyplace else. So that's our tradition. And it's very, I don't know if anybody else came across this or have ever participated in one, but
so
my
it's
children,
like a Seder? It's like
we call it the Seder.
Right.
And when one of my daughters was in college and she asked a friend, where are you going for Seder? And the friend laughed at her. She called me and she said, Ma, you never told me that nobody does this. I thought everybody did this because my kids didn't know. So
that's the problem with growing up in the diaspora, and especially with the overwhelming Ashkenazic influences that we grew up here in this country. Most people were Ashkenazic when we first came over. The Sephardic traditions started to come through and come about. Of course, now that Eretz Yisrael has been declared a state. We following a lot more of the Sephardic customs, which is one of the reasons why we have people even in the Ashkenazic synagogues that argue with each other because no, Ashkenazim don't do that. No, Sephardim do that. No, and we're getting mixed up now, which is kind of nice now. I guess we're becoming more and more mixed up. It's interesting when you talk about the head of the fish, though. Is that symbolic of the whale story, the fish?
No, I don't think so. It's may you be. That's a nice one. That's not a curse on our enemies. That one is may you be a head and not a tail.
Ah, okay.
And the pomegranate is may you do as many mitzvot as the pomegranate. And of course we make up our own. And my daughter, who is very secular, one of my daughters is secular and kind of a pacifist, has completely different ones that she makes up.
Pomegranate, of course, we have, I think we have some pomegranates in our own shul. I believe they're in the, what is it called? Over the ark.
Right. And every year, Ellie and his Israeli friends, call each other. Did you find the pomegranates? Who has them? Are they big? Are they red? Because it's sometimes a little tough to get a pomegranate here. Rabbi, I want to add something else about services too. When we talk about Sephardic, Ellie's family came from Kurdistan. He was born in Israel. His parents were born in the Ottoman Empire, which was Kurdish. They're Kurdish Jews. I don't know if any of you know anything about Kurdish Jews. And his brother was the founder of the synagogue in Boston, in Brookline. And the synagogue is not Ladino speaking, which a lot of us assume is Sephardic. Most of them speak Arabic or Farsi. There's a very large Iranian group. And the other ones, and many of them were raised speaking French, either from Morocco or the Libyans speak Italian. So they're Kurdish, Iranian, Iraqi, Libyan, Moroccan, some from France. And in the prayer book they used to use, it didn't say Good Yontif, it said Bon Année, which is French,
right.
Or, Happy New Year. Egyptian, where's Lila? Did she leave? No, I didn't see Lila. And the Egyptians, okay, the Nagars, and we have quite a few Egyptian. Hamaway is the other rabbi. And of course, 33 years ago, no, I think it's 35 years ago, there was a fight. So now there are two Sephardic congregations within a few blocks.
It was a fight? You mean two Jews didn't get along?
Shocking. Yes. It was about the height of the mechitza because even though it's Orthodox, this is sort of the liberal, Orthodox, and the women just sit behind tables without a mechitza.
Oh, okay.
And so but some people go between one and the other and, whatever. But I wanted to say that all the years that I belonged to Ner Tamid, and there was about a 20-year gap during some of the dark days at Ner Tamid with a former rabbi. Even all these years, even when I've been a member, we always did the high holidays in Brookline, always. And when I was on Zoom this year, I think maybe once or twice in the last 30 years or 40 years I've been to Ner Tamid, it was almost unrecognizable to me. Mm-hmm. So for example, Hineni, forget it, it's not part of the Sephardic tradition. Unetana Tokef, which is such an important thing. Nope, didn't happen. This year you did a video of El Nora Alila.
Yeah, that was a special request. Yeah,
major. Miel Kamocha, Hatanu, Anenu. These are things, and what's different is that even though there's a Hazan or a rabbi, it's very participatory, and everybody sings, and there are a zillion acrostics from Ibn Gibriel, and everybody outshouts each other, the men, to do one line of each one, and they use the Libyan tune, the Kurdish tune, or whatever, and they fight with each other about who can be louder. And over the years, I have to be very proudly say that Eliashiv was one of the loudest voices in the congregation, so a lot of it was Kurdish. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. It's just a very different service, and I enjoyed the, Zooming at Ner Tamid, and perhaps I'll go again, but Ellie really couldn't do it. He did his own thing and listened to tapes of his brother. The entire service is somewhere on YouTube.
And that of course is understandable. Look, when I went to a Sephardic synagogue in Israel, I was asked to attend a Sephardic minyan there with a family that hosted us in Afula, I think it was. And I was completely lost. I mean, I was completely in another place because of the different traditions that we have. It doesn't mean that we're not saying similar words, but we do it differently. We say it differently. We're all trying to get to the same place. But yes, the customs are definitely, and the prayer is definitely not the same. And you do have to get used to it. It does take time to get used to it. And like you said, Adrian, when you started, you weren't as embedded, so you didn't have the foundation of the Ashkenazic culture in you as much. And so your foundation right now is what you've seen. How many years now you've been going to the Sephardic?
40.
Yeah. So yeah,
well, 39 minus this year. Yeah.
Yeah, I can get that. And even my being here in our shul this was my 5th high holiday and my 2nd, I think, leading the cantorial. I come from different melodies too, right? And so I've compounded some of mine with some of theirs, and we try to bring as much similar sounds to traditional sounds, and try to offer as much we can to make everybody try to feel comfortable, but you can't. There's no way you'll make everybody feel comfortable. But I'm glad you enjoyed it. I understand Ellie wouldn't. I get that. I understand that because he's not familiar with this. Does anyone have any questions for Adrian about her culture and what she's been doing with regard to her family Seder for Rosh Hashanah? Or does anyone have their own particular customs that they do that are unique for Rosh Hashanah? Please open your mic and go ahead.
Hi, it's me. I'm
Hi,
curious. I'm curious. Where you live in Peabody, did you ever go to the Sephardic temple in Peabody?
The answer is one year Ellie went, I believe, for Sukkot, very early in our marriage, and we've lived in Peabody for 39 years,
Right.
and it wasn't open.
Oh,
And
well,
that congregation, by the way, was more from the Ladino heritage because they were from Greece and Turkey.
that's correct.
And coincidentally, Rabbi Morheim married us before we knew who he was. It was a recommendation. Again, thank you, Barry and Gail. And which was just coincidental. That's before we moved to Peabody or we had any contact with Ner Tamid. So I think the prayer book is probably the same.
It's very similar.
Yeah,
I went there for many years. My ex-husband's family is Sephardic. They were from Turkey and actually Cuba. So it was very Ladino. I don't remember doing a Seder, but I know that some of the foods were very traditional that we had. But the most memorable thing that I remember was during the high holiday service, how in Ladino, they would literally bid for the honors. And I loved that. And it was all in Sephardic, all in Spanish. And I don't speak Spanish, but cuánto something. How much money will I give to put on the silver crowns on the Torah? And they would all raise their hands. And the one who would bid the most money got the honor, and who would want to open up the ark. And it was fascinating how they carried this on during the service.
Well, for me, it wasn't fascinating. It was horrific because Ellie would always shoo me out of the house with the kids to get to Brookline early. And whenever we got there was at least an hour of an auction. I forgot the auction in English for all of the honors. And by the way, forget 18 and 54, meaningless, I think, because the numbers have to be odd, like 101. I don't even know what the numbers were. They would come up with weird numbers. I don't know what they represented. And they would do this. And there was no dues structure, or I should say, Rabbi, it was voluntary. And now there is a little bit of, but anybody was welcome to come. And lots of Israelis came who were not affiliated or not even Sephardic because it was free. And the auction was a very important part of it as well. I agree with that.
Yeah, well, the auction goes on in many different cultures too, by the way. That's not just Sephardic. I grew up with some of that too in the Ashkenazic world. Jeff Newton, did you have a question, comment?
No, I comment. When I was a kid, still living in Brooklyn, I would go with my grandfather to, I wouldn't call it, it was a shtibel. It was a small synagogue where the same thing happened. You would bid for an aliyah, but it wasn't in Ladino, it was in Yiddish. And it was an active bidding process, just like Sue said. So I think, as you say, that's not unique just to Sephardic. It occurred in an Ashkenazic shtibel. I remember it as clearly as if it were yesterday.
Yeah.
And it was in multiples, generally multiples of chai.
So that may be the difference in the number, but yeah, multiples of chai, right? And I think she's right, though. You didn't start at 36 or 18. You started at a lot more than that. There was a time when we were growing up, and I know some of you probably could remember this, on Yom Kippur when they had the pledge, they would look at the list of the people that were sitting there because they knew who you were, and they would say, Mrs. Savy, you pledged this year $100,000. And they would base it basically on who you were and your standing in the community. And, you know, Sue, $100,000. Thank you very much. Mrs. Teitelbaum, you pledged this year $1 million. You know, I mean, they told you what you gave. And I'm sure, I don't know, has anybody ever seen that before? Because I have. That's how old I am.
Rabbi,
I have too.
when our building was first, when our congregation was young, they had a meeting to which they invited all the male members of the congregation. It's probably a dinner. And then they went around the room asking for pledges to start, Henry would know about this, to start the fund for the temple. You don't remember, Henry? Because I remember Morty coming home and telling me about it. And you had to.
Henry probably led the meeting.
I probably avoided it.
Hey,
You
Carolyn,
were smart.
go ahead, Arlene.
But no, they asked you to publicly declare how much you were going to give. And this was the fundraisers when we first started the congregation. And it was thought to be so expensive. Pardon me, Sue?
It wasn't a lot of people. It was a small amount of people.
It was a goodly number at that point. And Morty came home and told me, and apparently people were so offended by it that they never did that again.
And that's one of the reasons that you're seeing fewer and fewer. You still see some. I see some up here that in Rhode Island, they had pretty much stopped it. Fewer and fewer agencies listing how much people gave in their books, right? You're seeing fewer and fewer of that. You're seeing people who gave, but you're not putting them into the categories anymore, because guess what's happened? A lot of people got upset with that concept and said, no, I'm not going to be associated with that. So it's a different world. It's a different world.
Phyllis.
Anyone else?
Yeah, Rabbi.
Yes, sir.
As growing up, I grew up in Cambridge in a congregation, and we had these auctions, if you will, on Yom Tovim all the time for all the various aliyos. And I was just a kid. And it bothered me then that they would take the time during a religious occasion to stop and ask people to donate. Now, at that time, this goes back to the early 30s, late 30s and early 40s. I don't recall, because my family wasn't that close to the congregation, whether there was a due structure or not. So it might well.
I wasn't around in the 30s, so I can't tell you. I don't know. You'd have to listen.
So that I don't know whether if there was a due structure or not. And this may have been why they had the auctions on Yom Tovim, just to get some money.
Right. Well, of course, that's the one. But look, everybody comes on Yom Kippur, right?
Right.
Yom Kippur is the biggest day for all synagogues everywhere, especially right around that Yisker time, right? So somewhere between say 10:30 and noon, right? That's when you figure you're going to have your largest group come in. That's when they stay. And so a lot of times, and that's why it was interesting, because there was a time when Kol Nidre was big too, but that stopped, and not as big as it was years and years ago. And so they would do the Kol Nidre appeal, but then it transferred over to the Yizkor appeal in most congregations. And yeah, and that's when they did it. They did it during the day in most places. Here, when I came here, you were doing it up until this year. You were doing it Kol Nidre night, the President's appeal. So,
Rabbi, I just want to add that in the services in Brookline, there is no Yizkor. There is no martyrology. And one of the things that's really very striking is they do it every Shabbat, but on the holidays, all the Kohanim leave barefoot, come back, you know, with every male has a talit over his head,
right.
And the children gather underneath. And this is regular, but certainly, you know, during the holidays.
Yeah,
That also was a tradition when I was growing up, dichening, they called it in Yiddish. And there were all kinds of, they were bad, the Kohanim were barefoot. They had the big talesim. But if you were, you couldn't look at them,
right,
because you'd go blind. That was the superstition. You had to avert your eyes.
And you look at you now.
Now look what happened. I can't see a thing. Does that look?
Are there any other comments you want to make? Because I want to get to Sukkot. I want to move on to Sukkot. Anyone else? Okay, then let's get on to Sukkot. Adrian, thank you so much for sharing that. I really wanted us to hear from you and hear about this, because we need to learn from each other. By the way, we have many customs that are similar, and they like asking for money. It's just it's just the way we do it, right? But there are certain things with regard to some of the foods that we eat, some of the ways that we do things that are different, and they come from different communities. But the bottom line is, when you all wrap it up, we're all trying to get to God, right? It's trying to get to God and trying to bless, Baruch Hashem, or, you know, bless God, and we do it in different ways. So it doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean it's right. It's how we feel comfortable. And, you know, when you say that Elisheb doesn't feel good or comfortable with the service, he wasn't brought up with it. And so I can understand it. It was like when I sat in a Sephardic shul in the north of Israel. I even remember I felt so embarrassed because they don't say Barichu, which is probably Baruch Hu, but it's got that Yiddish tint to it, right? They say Amen. And so here's this guy from America, never mind an Ashkenazic Jew. There's a guy from America who's standing in the shul yelling out, Baruch Hu, and they go, they say Amen here, you know?
Rabbi, did you happen to notice how they do Mourner's Kaddish in Sephardic shuls? Because I went to the big central shul in Israel, in Jerusalem. It happened to be my mother's yort site, and it occurs right after Sukkot. I also went there for Sukkot services, and I'll tell you about it when you talk about Sukkot. But I went there and they had a little minyan and a side chapel, and I could not follow the Yizkor. It is the most, and I tried to find, and it wasn't even in the book. That was how unusual. The book I had wasn't in there. There was a lot of extra stuff in there that I just had never heard.
Even in their regular daily prayers, they say every word. First of all, they don't skim like we do. They don't buzz. They say every word, but they're also saying different. So it is a little different. There are different customs and different ways of doing things.
Absolutely.
They didn't feel comfortable, you know, in a conservative setting, and vice versa. You know, we're not used to it. But we need to learn from each other, and we need to respect each other. Okay, so this isn't really going to be a give and take conversation. I'd like you all to close your mics, if you will, for a bit. This is a presentation that will be given on a video that I like to use, and this will give us a full depiction of what the holiday of Sukkot is all about.
Hi there, this is Rabbi David Foreman, and you are watching Aleph Beta. Sukkot is right around the corner, and we all know how to celebrate it. Mainly, we build these little huts, and we live in them for 7 days. But why do we do that? what are we actually commemorating on this day? And here's where we kind of get into a bit of a quandary. To see that quandary, I'd like to play a little game with you. It's called Big Deal, Little Deal. Here's how the game works. We're going to take each of the three main festivals of the Torah, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, and we're going to ask ourselves, what event does this holiday commemorate? And is the event a big deal or a little deal? So let's play our game. We'll start with Pesach, Passover. What event does it commemorate? Well, that's easy enough. It celebrates our exodus from slavery, the night we left Egypt. All right, so what do you say? Would you call that event a big deal or a little deal? Well, I don't know about you, but I would say that's like the biggest of deals, right? On a scale from 1 to 10, Pesach's event is like a 10. There's plagues, blood, darkness, hail, fire. The sea splits in this climactic moment of triumph. Death to the bad guys, salvation to the good guys. It's a very big deal. Plus, it's our Independence Day, the very beginning of our nation. All right, what about Shavuos? How big a deal is the event commemorated by Shavuot? Well, on a scale from 1 to 10, it's like an 11, right? I mean, Shavuos celebrates the moment an entire nation rendezvoused with God. The Almighty literally descended into our world on the top of a mountain to give us a document that would define our destiny, that would shape the course of world civilization. Without that event, where would we be? What would we be? We'd be no more than a nomadic tribe in the wilderness. We'd be missing a mission. We'd be missing a legacy. That's a really big deal. All right, so let's go to Sukkot. So what does this holiday commemorate? Well, we sleep in booths, and we do that, the Torah tells us, L'man yedu dorotechem, so that your generations will know, Kiba Sukkot hoshavti et bnei Israel, that I caused the children of Israel to dwell in booths, Botziyotam meretz Mitzrayim, when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. All right, we sleep in booths, because we all slept in booths in the desert. So let's play big deal, little deal. On a scale from 1 to 10, everybody, how big a deal is that booth thing? I'm pretty sure it's like, I don't know, a 3.5. I mean, it's all very nice to sleep in booths. Certainly nothing against it, but do we have to have a whole holiday commemorating it? So you're probably shaking your head right now. Oh, come on, Rabbi Foreman, the sukkahs, they aren't just about little huts. I seem to remember that the Talmud says something about miraculous clouds that protected the Israelites in the desert. And you know, that's actually true. The Talmud records a dispute as to what the holiday of Sukkot celebrates. One view is that it celebrates those booths that we slept in, but another Talmudic view is that the holiday commemorates what it calls Ananei HaKavod, clouds of glory that enveloped the people, protected them in the desert. So suppose we accept the second Talmudic view, that the holiday commemorates these miraculous clouds. Well, we certainly needed those clouds to survive. I mean, without divine protection of some sort, like those clouds, we would have perished in that uninhabited wilderness. We would have been killed by enemies or maybe wild animals. Isn't that worth celebrating? And, you know, to tell you the truth, you're right. But getting into that Talmudic explanation actually opens up some other problems. For example, does the Talmud really mean to tell us that we don't even know what we're celebrating on Sukkot, that it's actually subject to a dispute? I mean, think Passover, right? We know what we're celebrating. It's not like two views in the Talmud debate it. No one says Passover was really about celebrating God flying the Israelites out of Egypt on magic carpets or something. The facts of the Exodus, they aren't in dispute. How could something as basic as what we are celebrating on another holiday, on Sukkot, be open to dispute? So I'd like to suggest a theory here. Maybe there is a big deal in Sukkot, and it can be apprehended if we find its missing event. Here's what I mean by that. If you look at all the other holidays, you find that generally they commemorate a particular event, limited in time, that you could actually point to. I mean, Pesach, for example, it commemorates the night we went free. That's a particular event. Shavuot commemorates the moment we stood at Sinai and we received the Torah. But Sukkot at face value kind of breaks the pattern. It appears to commemorate 40 years worth of booth sleeping. Day in, day out, booths one night, booths the next. Is it really the case we have a holiday here that doesn't actually commemorate an actual event that you could point to, just like one thing, there it is? But maybe there is a discrete event with Sukkot too. And maybe if we can find it, we could see what the big deal in the holiday is all about. Let's return to that verse in the Torah, that verse that describes why it is we celebrate Sukkot. Let's see what it tells us. The Torah says we celebrate Sukkot, L'man yedu doratechem, so that generations will know, Ki basukkot hoshavti et bnei Yisrael, that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths, Behotzii otam meretz Mitzrayim, when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. Now listen carefully to those words. When I brought them out of the land of Egypt. What exactly is the Torah saying right there? It sounds like the Torah was talking about a particular point in time, right? God made us sleep in booths when he brought us out of Egypt, not 40 years in the desert. That was way after he brought us out of Egypt. Seemingly, if we take the words of the verse really seriously, it was right when he brought us out that we slept in those booths. Wait a second, that sounds crazy. Is this whole booth commemoration thing really all going back to the very moment of the Exodus, like the first night? To find out, let's go back to the Torah's own description of those very first moments of leaving Egypt, way back in the book of Exodus. Is there anything there that involved Sukkot in some way? So listen to this verse. It describes the very beginning of Israel's journey away from Egypt. Vayisu b'nei Yisrael me Ramses Sukkota, and the children of Israel, they journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, k'sheshmot elef raglei agvarim levad mitaf, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. So read that verse again. Where did they travel to when they were leaving Ramses? They traveled to a place called Sukkot. Now, isn't that quite a coincidence? Sukkot just happens to be the name of the very first place that Israel encamped on their very first night after leaving Egypt. And you gotta ask yourself, is that a coincidence? I mean, we have a Sukkot holiday that supposedly celebrates God causing us to dwell in Sukkot, quote, when he took us out of Egypt, and lo and behold, right when God took us out of Egypt, the Torah mentions we slept at a place called Sukkot. Could it be that the holiday commemorates where we slept that first night in the desert? In other words, to be perfectly frank with you, what I'm suggesting is actually something that kind of seems radical. When the Torah says that the holiday commemorates God having made us dwell in Sukkot, maybe the verse isn't actually referring to what we slept in. Maybe it's referring to a place we slept at, a place called Sukkot. But wait a second, you might say. What are you trying to tell me? That all those rabbis, the ones in the Talmud who talked about Sukkot celebrating sleeping in booths, the ones who talked about the clouds of glory, you're trying to tell me that they were all just wrong? That they missed this obvious implication of the verses? And anyway, Foreman, let's just say you're right, that Basukot Hoshavti means that God settled us in the place called Sukkot. Why should we celebrate that? Who cares where we slept that first night we left Egypt? I mean, look, every place has got to have a name. This place, it happened to get called Sukkot. Great, time to feast. That's what we're celebrating? So here would be my response to that. The theory I'm suggesting to you, it doesn't actually oppose what the rabbis of the Talmud say. On the contrary, I'd argue, it's the basis for what they say. It's their point of departure. In other words, the rabbis of the Talmud, they too understood that the holiday commemorates our sleeping in a place called Sukkot. The rabbis were just making the following obvious inference. Why do you think the place got called that? Why, of all things, would you call a place Sukkot, basically the Hebrew equivalent of shantytown? It's probably because people made these little shanties, these little Sukkot huts to sleep in there. And here's the proof of the pudding. It turns out that here in Exodus, is not the first time the Torah mentions to us a place by the name of Sukkot. Way back in Genesis, we encountered a place named that too. When Jacob left Laban's house, exiting his own personal slavery in his father-in-law's domain, one of the first places he came to was a place called Sukkot. And the Torah tells us why it was called that. Jacob built little huts there for his cattle, huts called Sukkot. And the Torah tells us that's why he called the name of the place Sukkot. So basically in Exodus, it seems like the Torah is just kind of using shorthand to get its point across. It's basing itself upon what it assumes we already know from the book of Genesis. In other words, the verse says, the Israelites, like Jacob before them, they also exited slavery. And like Jacob before them, they also had lots of cattle. And the very next thing we hear about is that like Jacob before them, the people slept in a place called Sukkot. So, how did the place get its name? That's left implied. Obviously, it's because they built Sukkot there, little huts for their cattle, just like Jacob did in similar circumstances. The difference between the people and Jacob, if anything, is that while Jacob had built a house for himself and huts for the cattle, when it came to the people leaving Egypt, there weren't separate domiciles for people and cattle. Rather, Basukot Hoshavti. It was in Sukkot, shanties made for cattle, that we humans slept. Sukkot here is place, but it's place because of those shanties. That night, everybody, cows, sheep, people, everybody slept in those shanties. And that, according to Leviticus, is what we celebrate. God says, I made you sleep in Sukkot that first night. That's where I settled you. Okay, but now let's get back to that second objection I just raised with you. Let's say we grant that the Torah is asking us to celebrate a single night's encampment in the desert in little huts. So, why was that really such a big deal? Why would we be celebrating for generations what happened that very first night? Is that really the big missing event? The answer is that night, in those huts, it actually was a momentous turning point. Come with me for a minute back into the Torah's description of that very first night. You'll find a curious thing. Right after we hear about that first night in the place called Sukkot, the Torah tells us something else that seems fairly trivial. It takes a step back to give us what looks like an accounting of the total years we spent in slavery. Umoshav b'nei Yisrael asher yoshvu b'Mitzrayim. Now the time the children of Israel dwelt in Egypt, shloshim shana v'arba'mot shana, 430 years. Now, why would the Torah do that? Why would it bother to tell us this right now as it's chronicling the night the nation spent in Sukkot? I mean, why is the Torah suddenly interested in playing accountant with us, making sure you know exactly how many years they spent in Egypt? The answer, I think, will kind of jump out at you if you pay attention to another phrase in those words I just read to you. Don't get distracted by the 430 years. Instead, look at the verse's first words, Umoshav b'nei Yisrael asher yoshvu b'Mitzrayim. I'll translate it literally for you. And the settling downs that the children of Israel settled down while they were in Egypt were 430 years. The Torah is establishing a very interesting contrast for you, the reader, here. For 430 years, the people had been settled down. They had a real roof over their heads. They might have been guests in Egypt. They might even have been slaves, but they knew that when they got home at night, they had a reliable shelter over their heads, a real home in which to sleep. They knew where their next meal was coming from. In an instant, all that changed. It changed that very first night of freedom when they found themselves sleeping in those cattle pens alongside the sheep and the cows. It changed when, after 430 years of being settled, of having a moshav in Egypt, they were settled by God into these little cattle pens in the desert. It all changed that night in Sukkot. Stop and think for a minute. What must that night have been like? Here they were, the first night away from Egypt. It was the first night they experienced without a master's lash at their backs. That night, they breathed in the heady air of freedom. For the very first time in generations, they could come and go as they pleased. They could make choices. On the one hand, it was like living a dream. But the dream was also full of terror. They were in the desert. They had nowhere real to sleep, no home to call their own. They were sleeping with their cattle, for goodness sake, right next to Bessie the cow and Spotty the sheep. You could almost imagine what might have been going through their minds. It was ridiculous. What am I even doing here? What have I done by leaving Egypt? To add to the ridiculousness of the situation, the Torah tells us one more thing about that night. It tells us what they ate that night when they were sleeping in the Sukkot. Let's read a little bit more from those verses. Vayofu et habatzak asher hotziim miMitzrayim, and they baked the dough that they brought forth out of Egypt, ugot matzot, kilo chametz, unleavened bread, because it didn't have enough time to rise. Ki gorshu b'Mitzrayim, because they were cast out of Egypt. Lo yachlu litmamea, they didn't have time to tarry. V'gam tzeda lo asu lahem, they didn't even have time to take provisions for the journey. So it was some night that night, under the stars, with not even any decent bread to eat. But you read those verses and you say, one second, wait a minute. They made matzah that first night? You're thinking to yourself, but matzah making isn't a Sukkot activity. It's a Pesach activity. On Pesach we eat unleavened bread to remember how we rushed out of Egypt. What are we doing here? We pieced together all of these clues about this very first night in Sukkot, only to arrive at what, a different holiday? Something really interesting is beginning to emerge, it seems to me. There are two holidays in the Torah, Pesach and Sukkot, that somehow both seem to be commemorating the same event, the very first night that Israel spent alone in the desert. The only difference between these holidays seems to be one of perspective. One holiday, Pesach, commemorates the first night we spent in the desert from the perspective of food. We remember what we ate that night. The other holiday, Sukkot, commemorates the night in terms of where we slept. The two basic needs of life are, of course, food and shelter. We had them both in abundance in Egypt, bread for the eating and a real roof over our heads. We had those necessities, but we were missing freedom. It seemed free, the bread and the roof, but there was a price. We were slaves. Suddenly, in an instant, everything changed. God caused 10 plagues to descend upon our tormentors, and suddenly, our masters were powerless to keep us tethered to them anymore. We could go now. The question is, would we? We made a choice the moment we left Egypt, a crazy choice if you stop to think about it. We made a choice to embrace freedom, to accept God's invitation to become his nation, and to travel to a land that he promised us, a land that we had never seen, all without any real preparation. There was no logistical infrastructure for that journey. Imagine tasking a modern-day Army Corps of Engineers with the duty to lay the infrastructure for a walk through the desert that would last 40 years, and 2.3 million people would be taking the journey. The project would cost billions of dollars. You'd have to set up roads, plumbing, Safeways, malls for clothing, a few 7-Elevens for good measure. But none of that would be in place for the Israelites' journey. It was a choice thrust on them in an instant. This is your chance. Are you ready to go? The choice to leave can't be described as anything other than a supreme act of faith. We quite literally placed ourselves in the embrace of the divine, and we said, in effect, "You're inviting us, God, and we're going. Our most basic needs, they're now in your hands." The text that tells us of the journey to Sukkot emphasizes the tentative nature of that journey by telling us, Gam Seda Lo Asu Lahem, they hadn't even packed any provisions. There they were that first night, sleeping under the stars in the ridiculous cattle pens they set up for their animals, and there they were eating their last morsel of half-baked bread, realizing with stunning clarity that there was no more where that came from. There they were for the first time, utterly and totally in God's embrace. That was the night that these two holidays, Pesach and Sukkot, are celebrating. We asked earlier what the big deal was about Sukkot. Making Sukkot doesn't seem to be as earth-shattering an event as Revelation or as the Exodus, but I think the answer is it was earth-shattering what happened that first night, earth-shattering in a quiet, terrifying kind of way. The act of faith is always earth-shattering, the pit in your stomach as you look around in the desert and feel all alone, only to have it dawn on you that you're not really alone. There is someone else there, one other being. It's God. It's just you and God now. You've just left everything behind that you took for granted, and you've made this harrowing choice to completely rely on God. If God doesn't come through here for you, the next night could just be your last. The prophet Jeremiah says something to us about God's memories of that first night. Haloch v'karata ba'oznei Yerushalayim lemor, go and call out to Jerusalem, saying, Ko amar Hashem, thus says God, Zacharti lach chesed nurayach. I remember the gifts of kindness of your youth, avat klulotayich, the love of your bridal days, lech tech acharei b'midbar, when you followed me out into the wilderness, be'eretz lo zruah, in a land that was desolate, that couldn't grow anything. That night, it was a big deal. It was a big deal for us. It was a big deal for God. It was the night we gave God the gift of trust. I mentioned to you before that there's a dispute among the sages as to what we celebrate on Sukkot. Are we commemorating the booths that we slept in, or the divine clouds of glory? I wonder if there might be something complementary in the two of those views. In other words, if you go back to that first night in the desert when we slept in those booths, there were really two important things that happened simultaneously. The first thing that happened was that we slept in those little booths. That's what we did, the people of Israel. But we weren't the only ones who did something that night. God did something too. We put ourselves vulnerable in God's hands, ceding our most basic need for protection to Him. God saw us leap into the darkness, as it were, and He responded to our act with an act of His own. He provided for us in the desert. He sheltered us. He says, I see your shanty towns. I'll raise you one. I'll establish for you clouds of glory. I'll turn your token efforts at providing shelter for yourselves, efforts that you know are not adequate. I'll turn those efforts into miraculous sustenance and protection. I'll envelop you in divine clouds. God understood our need for protection, and He responded in kind. We woke up the next morning safe and sound. The next morning and the morning after that too, day in and day out, for 40 years. As for the dispute as to what we commemorate on Sukkot, now I think we understand that the dispute isn't really about what happened. Did we sleep in booths, or did God protect us with divine clouds? Both happened. The dispute is about what we're commemorating on this holiday. The Talmudic view that suggests we're commemorating the booths, the Sukkot, is suggesting that we're commemorating our act, the human act of faith, the leap into the darkness that was the first night stay in Sukkot. That was an act of faith, and if you think about it, it was an act of love. The greatest gift we give another in love is our willingness to trust them, to cede control to them, to put ourselves completely in their hands. That's what we did that first night. But the other Talmudic view, it suggests that we're commemorating God's reciprocating our act with a protective act of love of His own. One view suggests that we're commemorating Israel's heroism when we celebrate Sukkot. The other view suggests it's God's heroism, His willingness to be our knight in shining armor, as it were, that we celebrate on Sukkot. One last little wrinkle, it seems to me, remains to be dealt with. if this theory is to be accepted, this theory that, on some level, Pesach and Sukkot both celebrate the very same night, but from different perspectives, if we're to accept that theory, we kind of need to wonder, why are these holidays separated by so much time on the calendar? Look, it makes sense that we celebrate Chag HaMatzot on the 15th of Nisan. That's the night we started eating matzah. But what about Sukkot? Why in the world would we celebrate it months later on another date entirely? Why choose a date that seems to bear no obvious connection to the Exodus at all? Well, here's a clue for starters. The date on which we celebrate Sukkot is not just any old random date. The 15th of Tishrei is, in an intriguing way, related to Pesach. It occurs exactly 6 months after the onset of Chag HaMatzot. It's actually the date at the exact opposite end of the calendar, the farthest you can get from the middle of Nisan. It seems like the Torah was specifically situating Sukkot at the furthest calendrical point from Pesach that it possibly could. And maybe that's because that's when Sukkot is needed most. Because Sukkot is not just at the furthest point calendrically from that first night, but at the furthest point experientially too. The farthest we as a nation get from that first night in temporary shelter, when we were nothing but a ragtag band of escaped slaves huddled around campfires in no man's land, the farthest point we get from that is when we're a sovereign nation, in our own land, living in sturdy homes with the security of a successful harvest behind us. It's at that moment, when our home is our fortress, that we snuggle up under the covers knowing exactly where our next meals are coming from. That's the night we're supposed to begin to celebrate Sukkot. The 15th of Tishrei, the Torah itself says, is a time of ingathering of grain. The harvest is finally over. At this time of year, we are most susceptible to the belief that we're self-sufficient, that we've brought into our homes these sturdy structures, the food that will secure our future. Until now, maybe we were vulnerable. When we planted the grain back in the spring, the seedlings might not take, there might not be rain, but now at Sukkot time, ba'os bechem et tvuat ha'aretz, in the words of the verse, when we gather in the grain into our homes, now our homes at this time of year, they've become veritable fortresses of agricultural security. Now we're finally safe and secure. It is then that we're asked to leave our home behind and reoccupy the huts we slept in that first night. In doing so, we recreate the precious gift of that first night, the gift of trust. Then we had placed ourselves fragile and vulnerable into the care of our Creator, and so we do now. Now, even when we do have a roof over our heads, even when we've got indoor plumbing and the niceties of electricity, even when we have sofas, coffee tables, Keurig machines, now we place ourselves under the Creator's protection, just as we did back then. We do it because we understand that, on some level, a home is little more than a hut. The security it provides is illusory. We do it because it's only a little pig who believes that if he makes his home not out of straw, not out of wood, but out of bricks, then the big bad wolf can't huff and puff and blow the house down. But we know that's not true. All houses can be blown down if the hurricane is terrifying enough and if the enemy is ominous enough. Real security always comes from God. Sukkot, all told, was about a gift of love, a gift of faith that we as a people gave to our Creator, and a gift of care that He reciprocated to us in turn. It's these gifts we're asked to remember, to recreate year after year every Sukkot, so that we never forget the embrace of our heavenly protector.
I hope you enjoyed that. That's a beautiful presentation. And let me stop it. And very informative, you know, as we talk about the connections of the holidays. We talk about customs too as well, and how important it is for us to remember that they're all a 10 or an 11. Every holiday has its meaning and purpose, and I think they're all connected. And one of the things that we do, I have a custom too, Adrian, that I've been following over the years, is that we take our lulav and etrog at the end of Sukkot when we're done with it, and the arava, the willows, we take, and we, in some synagogues, they throw them up on top of the ark, they throw them behind, they throw them somewhere, so that we can use them on Pesach when we're looking for the chametz. You know, some people use a feather, some people use the willows to connect Pesach and Sukkot together. And what connects Pesach to Sukkot? Of course, there's that third festival, the one where we count from Pesach, the Omer, to Shavuot. So it is all connected, and it is all about love of God. And so I thought you'd enjoy that presentation today, and I hope that it was informative for you as well. I love his work. He's got a great presentation. I know some of it's through the cartoon, but the message is very, very powerful, and I hope we learned from it today. So with that, final comment. We have 1 minute left. Anybody have a comment?
I want to thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, Adrian, we learned a lot today.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was very informative.
It was very interesting.
I want to wish everybody a good Chol Hamoed, the rest of the festival, Chag Sameach, enjoy, and we'll see you at 7 o'clock.
And thank you, Rabbi, for getting me in.
Nice seeing you. Very nice seeing you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you all. Be well.